A secret Soviet city called Arzama 16. One carried scientists, one carried soldiers, and one carried an atomic bomb.
It hardly needs to be said that the whole operation took place in the greatest secrecy. Along the whole route, not a single signal was against the special trains. All the points were switched in their favor.
They were on their way to Kazakhstan, where they would test the first red bomb.
Everything was done according to a strict plan, in case anyone tried to ambush the train on its journey.
At a Politburo meeting a few days before, someone had asked, "What will we do if the bomb doesn't work?" Stalin replied, "We can shoot the scientists." At the end of the track lay a moment of truth that would rock the post-war world. In the early years following the end of World War II, Americans celebrated. They had triumphed in Japan. They had beaten back the fascist threat in Europe. They alone possessed the ultimate weapon. Americans felt they were on top of the world, and no one could knock them off. What they didn't know was at that very moment, Soviet intelligence was mobilizing for one of the greatest espionage coups of all time. "50 years later, Soviet agents still have reunions to celebrate their victory in Europe and to remember the KGB triumphs in the Cold War that followed. One of their top men, General Pavel Sudoplatov, has his own memories of this time. As the war was drawing to a close, he was given an important new job, a mission that would forever change the balance of power in the world.
I was instructed to set up a special department at the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs to develop the atomic project. That department was known as Department S.
Отдел S, он так назывался, отдел S.
The Commissariat, or Secret Police, was housed in the Lubyanka, then the most feared building in the Soviet Union. Sudoplatov knew the corridors and staff of the Commissariat well. Trained as an assassin, he had been in charge of sabotage and guerrilla action during World War II. His new job had the potential to claim even more victims. Department S was to be the top-secret information center of the Soviet bomb program. In the Lubyanka vaults were some 10,000 documents about America's bomb, the product of years of wartime espionage under the direction of Lavrenti Beria, Stalin's hatchet man, by reputation the most ruthless schemer in the Kremlin, by habit a man obsessed with secrecy. When the Western documents first started coming in, Beria allowed only one man to know they existed: Igor Kurchatov, the brilliant physicist who ran the Soviet bomb program. Kurchatov did his best to keep up with the flood of incoming information. Without help, it was an impossible task. Just how weak the Soviets' position was became painfully clear when the American atomic bombs devastated Japan. A furious Stalin issued an ultimatum. A Soviet bomb must be ready in 5 years or else. Stalin put Beria in charge and hired Pavel Sudoplatov. Sudoplatov first job was to enlist people who knew enough science to understand what was in the vaults, but had enough discretion not to tell anyone it was there. The secret police did the recruiting. The first person to get a visit was a young physicist named Yakov Terletsky.
I was suddenly summoned to the NKVD headquarters on Lubyanka Street. A summons to Lubyanka was always regarded as something very unpleasant.
Next to get a visit from Sudoplatov's recruiting team was Arkady Rylov.
One of the older men said, "You have to go to Lubyanka Street." That was too much for me, and I said, "What have I done?" They burst out laughing. I thought they were taking me to the Lubyanka for a different purpose. That was just a practical joke they pulled on me. They said, "We are not sending you to jail, you are to be offered a job."
I informed Beria of my choice. He asked me to check those two men out, to find if they drank, talked too much, and so on. I told him I didn't know them that well as yet. Beria replied, "This is what you should do. Organize a dinner party in your flat and invite Terletsky and Rylov. Make sure you have as many bottles of brandy, vodka, and wine as possible on the table during dinner, and prepare several kinds of hors d'oeuvres." I asked him where I would find all that. He replied, "Don't worry about a thing. We'll deliver it all straight to your flat."
It was a posh party, a staggering party for the time. There were wines and all kinds of appetizers. I noticed that Sudoplatov drank very little. He just sipped. I noticed the others were also drinking little, so I followed their example. Toasts were raised, Stalin's health was drunk, then Beria's and all kinds of toasts, and then we parted company.
The two young scientists passed the test and went to work as espionage agents for Department S. They would be overwhelmed by the secrets they would find within the Lubyanka walls.
It's quite clear that this very valuable, super valuable information was put on ice for 4 years. It's a fact. This is why Department S wasn't set up until after the 2 bombs exploded in Japan. Then everyone remembered, so to speak. Oi, didn't we get information about this as much as 4 years ago?
The Soviet secret police had been stuffing their files with atomic documents since the early days of the war. Some of the most useful came through New York, passed on by a KGB controller working out of the Soviet consulate. His name was Anatoly Yakovlev. He was part of a project codenamed Operation Enormous, the spy ring which would become notorious as one of the most successful intelligence networks ever run on foreign soil. But in post-war New York, Yakovlev was still unknown, except to a pair of FBI agents, one of them named Robert Lamphere. Agent Lamphere recalls the time he followed Yakovlev into a Manhattan cinema. On the screen was Russian news footage of triumphant Soviet troops marching through Moscow to celebrate the end of the war.
Yakovlev went in and sat down in a very good seat about halfway down. The theater was maybe 25–30% full. We settled in a few minutes later, 4 or 5 rows in back of Yakovlev. And both of us got very much interested in the film that was being shown. And the next thing I looked up and Yakovlev was gone. And I thought, oh God.
Но самоотверженной борьбой против фашизма спас цивилизацию Европы.
We hurriedly looked around the theater, and here he was, way down front, way off to one side, in a very poor seat.
Lamphere was immediately suspicious. He left the cinema that day feeling he had witnessed something important.
That in all likelihood, we had seen the servicing of a dead drop. In other words, somebody had come in and put something under that seat. Yakovlev had spotted where they were, number 3 seat over, row 8. Had gone down and reached under, darkened theater, and retrieved the message.
In 1945, lots of messages were being exchanged. Soviet espionage in America was in full swing, and the single most important focus of spy master Yakovlev's work was passing on details of America's bomb. The prototype would be exploded at a site codenamed Trinity. It had been built by some of the best scientists in the world, many of them refugees from Hitler's Germany. At least one of them was a spy working for Yakovlev, physicist Klaus Fuchs. Fuchs had fled Germany years before when Nazi brown shirts attacked him for being a communist. He had settled in the UK and within a few years was working on England's nuclear bomb program. In 1943, when the Allies had agreed to pool their talents on the Manhattan Project, Fuchs' communist past was overlooked. British security gave him clearance and sent him to America to work on their atomic bomb program. But Fuchs' loyalty to the Communist Party never wavered. From the moment he was able, he passed on vital nuclear information to the Soviets through a web of Operation Enormous contacts. Sometime in the summer or fall of 1945, Fuchs smuggled a package out of Los Alamos for delivery to Yakovlev in New York, and from there to the Soviet Union. We have obtained the translation that Department S made from those documents as soon as they arrived in Moscow. For more than 40 years, these reports and drawings were locked away in a Soviet vault. No Westerner had laid eyes on them since the originals were spirited out of Los Alamos. On advice from nuclear experts, we have removed critical parts of the diagram from the document in our possession. What we can show clearly is the word at the top of the page, Trinity. Fuchs had stolen a blueprint of America's first bomb. Armed with vital nuclear secrets from the West, Department S was able to surge ahead. But having the plans in hand did not mean they could immediately produce a bomb. Moscow was a desperate place after the war. Manufacturing capabilities were virtually wiped out. Food was scarce, but Soviet commitment to fighting the capitalist menace was growing more powerful by the minute. Resources were redirected. Food was somehow found, and the men and women who toiled for Department S were rewarded handsomely for their hard work.
Department S enjoyed a special status, and the personnel had perks. We had food coupons and other coupons for consumer goods shops. Also, we had breakfast brought to us every day by the char lady, or whatever you'd call her. We didn't eat up the food right away. We would hoard it in our desks and try to take it home. Of course, there were lots of cockroaches and mice running about.
We started work at 10 in the morning and worked until 5 o'clock in the afternoon. There was a break from 5 o'clock to 8 o'clock, and then we worked until midnight at the earliest, but sometimes until 2 in the morning.
Inside Department S, there was a lot of catching up to do. The pace was unrelenting.
There were 2 large steel safes which contained the materials. There were around 10,000 various items. There were photocopies of documents, US documents, super secret US documents. A stamp on each document said it was secret and its disclosure was punishable as espionage.
When these files with translations were prepared, we were told, get this or that file ready for a session of the Scientific and Technical Council. And we consulted the procedures manual to keep to the rules for transferring classified materials. The scientists, Rylov and Terletsky, took them from us and went to report at Kirov Street.
Kirov Street was only 300 yards away from the Lubyanka. Rylov and Terletsky would make the short trip by car under military guard.
Lieutenant accompanied me. He kept a Walter handgun in his pocket. It was so secret.
Number 20 Kirov Street was where the Scientific and Technical Council met under the chairmanship of Boris Vanikov. It was the brain center of the Soviet atomic bomb project.
We came and were invited into the reception room and were asked to make our reports.
After Terletsky or I gave our report, Vanikov would say, comrades, those who need this information, raise your hands. They did.
The scientists at Kirov Street devoured the information provided by Terletsky and Rylov.
For example, 3 persons would want one work, or 10 would want another, or as many as 15 would want a third one.
If the scientists asked about its source, they were led to believe it came from a rival team of physicists.
Vanikov said these were materials produced by Bureau Number 2. This raised suspicions. What was Bureau Number 2? No one knew what it was. But Vanikov tactfully parried all questions. He said, "Oh, Bureau Number 2, you'll know what it is in due course."
Security Chief Beria would never let them know the materials were the product of years of espionage. Soon, spies and scientists alike were drowning in all the stolen information. They needed a shortcut, and Beria needed confirmation his men were on the right track. Fall 1945. Beria burst into Kurchatov's office with an idea. One of the leading lights in atomic physics had recently returned to Denmark from working on the Manhattan Project. During the war, Nobel laureate Niels Bohr had insisted that atomic information should be shared among nations. Allied leaders had ignored his advice. Now, Beria hoped Bohr might be persuaded to put his views into action and reveal America's atomic secrets to the Soviet Union.
Niels Bohr was, to all of that generation of physicists, a kind of father figure, a great scientist, a great physicist in his own right, somebody who had done as much, probably more than anyone else, to create this international community of physicists who had a great belief in what the internationalism of science could do for the human race.
The Soviets fancied Bohr a potential sympathizer. They schemed for what they hoped would be a turning point in the creation of the Red Bomb.
We needed a meeting with Bohr. I don't need to explain to you who Bohr is. You probably know he was a great man. At that point, we had come to a deadlock in the development of the atom bomb in certain aspects, and we didn't know what to do. It was decided to send Terlecki to Bohr.
Sudoplatov summoned me and said, Beria wants to talk to you. We waited in the anteroom for some time, and finally Beria received us. He made a very depressing impression on me. He was a man of medium height, so to speak, not even a suggestion of smile. A very forbidding face. A very forbidding look. No hint of goodwill. He said hello and then began asking questions. How are you going to travel there? What kind of questions will you ask? And what about the language barrier?
Terlecki's specialty was statistical, not atomic physics. He was chosen simply because Beria didn't trust any of the leading physicists, and time was running out. Kurchatov and his colleagues gave Terlecki a crash course in the basics of nuclear science.
I could understand the general principle, but how was the explosive prepared, and what exactly is plutonium? They'd begun to explain things to me. It was a veritable lecture. Kurchatov was the chief lecturer. I could write, record everything, and he told me everything from the very beginning.
Within 24 hours, Terlecki, accompanied by a translator and a security officer, set off for the long journey from Moscow to Copenhagen. It was a highly sensitive mission, and all three men were nervous.
I sensed already that we were being watched en route, and Vasilievsky said, look, this man here is a US intelligence man, and that one, the Finnish intelligence agent. They were watching us all the time. Finally, we reached the embassy. At first, I wasn't even allowed to leave the embassy. I was under lock and key.
After an agonizing wait of 2 weeks, they finally got the signal to make the short drive to the Niels Bohr Institute. They were told to leave their notebooks behind.
We weren't allowed to carry any papers, because the idea was that by carrying a paper, we might leave behind a document. We had to memorize everything, both the questions and the answers, and keep everything in our heads. Niels Bohr gave us a fairly reserved welcome. When he shook hands with me, I noticed his hands were shaking.
It began as a social visit, with Bohr asking about old Russian friends and colleagues from the university days. Then Terlecki tried to get down to business.
Bohr's answers weren't enthusiastic because many of the questions were such that there were things he didn't know. We asked about the design of the atomic bomb or separation facilities, which Bohr didn't know.
Bohr was a theoretician, not a designer, and he was not familiar with most of the specific details of the Manhattan Project. It was a troubling meeting for Terlecki, who knew better than to disappoint Beria. 2 days later, the Soviets returned to the Bohr Institute for further talk. At the second meeting, Bohr presented them with a gift, a mimeographed copy of a book about the building of America's bomb, written by a physicist on the Manhattan Project named Henry Smythe. The book's intention was to define what was public and what was secret about the atomic bomb program, to give the scientists a clear idea of what they could discuss freely. The report had been released 3 months earlier, a few days after the bombing of Hiroshima. By September, ads for it ran in the New York Times, and Soviets in America were said to be snapping up copies. For Terlecki, the Smythe report was big news, and Department S would rush to circulate it.
A copy was brought over, it was translated, processed, and edited very fast, and a small number of copies were printed. I even had a copy myself, but I lost it somewhere. At first, the book carried either the stamp "secret" or a copy number.
Гриф секретно, то ли номер экземпляра стоял.
Though it appalled the British, publication of the book had been approved by President Truman. The Manhattan Project head General Groves considered it harmless. He ordered Smythe to release only information which competent scientists working in a college lab could discover in a year's time. Still, the Smythe report may have given the Soviets clues about approaches not to pursue.
I think there's another totally different lesson to be learned out of this, and that is there really are no secrets. That is, if one person can figure something out, then it's likely another person's going to be figuring it out about the same time. And it doesn't take much information to get them on the right track. There really are no secrets.
The true nature of the meeting with Bohr has been a topic of hot debate. According to Western documents, Bohr alerted proper authorities to the Soviet visit, but the former head of Department S still thinks he outfoxed them all.
But we got what we wanted. The point is, Bohr was very friendly towards the Soviet Union.
Bohr's own explanation, according to Terlecki, was even more stunning.
Every country should know about the design of the atomic bomb and possess the atomic bomb itself. And of these other countries, the first to obtain the atomic bomb should be Russia.
Bohr's endorsement of the Smythe report probably gave the Soviets confidence to study the text without fear of disinformation. They were one step closer to becoming a nuclear power. A few months after the meeting with Bohr, Kurchatov's right-hand man was sent on a journey across the country. Yuli Hariton, now 90, was then an expert in explosives. In his youth, he'd studied at Cambridge, England, where many of the scientists responsible for the world's first atomic bomb had also studied.
I think Hariton, therefore, is a central figure in this whole story. He had been friends with Kurchatov, had known Kurchatov since their days together at Yoffa's Institute in the 1920s. The two men clearly worked very well together. It was Kurchatov who decided to ask Hariton to take on this part of the whole project. Much to many people's surprise, because the kind of normal vision of what a manager was in Stalinist times was somebody who was able to bang the table and make threats. not somebody who is quiet in manner and civilized in manner.
In 1946, what Haraton was looking for was a remote location in which to build Russia's first atomic bomb.
What was needed was an open space with a populated area nearby, where work with explosions could be carried out.
These days, he travels in some style with his own personal housekeeper, Claudia Yegorova. After 40 years, she's acquired the habit of secrecy about her boss's work.
Это вагон ее либорейщик персональный. Конечно, ему дали за заслуги то, что
Ну, что он сделал? То есть какая заслуга-то какая? То, что он, в общем, главный конструктор, создавший атомную бомбу.
Ну, то, что он вот, главный конструктор, создавший атомную бомбу.
Да это не секрет, главный конструктор.
Back in 1946, Haraton visited a series of possible sites before settling on one just 400 miles outside Moscow. And this is the place he chose, the town of Sarov, where a 19th century hermit named Saint Seraphim once preached, and where czars once came to pray. Over the next few years, Sarov sprouted a mighty suburb, cloaked in secrecy, and devoted entirely to the production of an atomic weapon. It was called Arzamas 16. Thousands of prisoners from the Gulag were herded together to carry out the construction work.
I was struck by the fact that the construction work was being done by prisoners, who at the time all lived in secure zones. So morning and night, columns of these prisoners went by under guard.
The senior scientist in residence, Yuli Haraton, took a realistic view of his new workforce.
It was very unpleasant, but what were we to do? I realized that we couldn't get by in any other way. There was nowhere else to get the number of people needed to push construction work here ahead at the speed required.
For over 40 years, no Arzamas 16 without permission. It was a closed city where everyone lived under guard, part of a network of secret communities in which for years everything was geared toward the production of nuclear weapons. Under Stalin and Beria, people lived in fear as well as isolation. Even the scientists were under suspicion.
Of course, I was kept under what is called observation. Of that, there is absolutely no doubt. There was basically a duty officer from the security service constantly at my side at all times. What it amounted to was that they simply lived at our apartment. They were around the whole time.
The secret police had informers everywhere. This was a security operation which meant business, and the price for stepping out of bounds was high. One person to pay that price was the head of the Capital Works Department at the installation. He was the first person to get an official business trip back to Moscow.
в кругу родственников рассказал о том, что
He told a bunch of his relatives that soon we were going to screw the Americans and that he was getting through a budget of so many millions that we could expect our great project to be a success. That was enough for the KGB to press for him to receive an 8-year sentence in a high-security prison.
In that climate of fear, others didn't wait for official punishment.
One of the workers at the first section transferred some documents from one folder to another, forgot about it, and couldn't find them. And foreseeing all these problems, because there was no way he could prove that he hadn't sold it to someone, to some spy, he shot himself.
The facilities to build the bomb were up and functioning, but there was still a crucial ingredient missing, a good supply of uranium. A critical breakthrough came from occupied East Germany, and it probably saved a year's work. Soviet scientists working in post-war Germany heard rumors of large supplies of uranium somewhere near the American zone.
They themselves didn't know exactly where it was. So we set off around the factory, and we went into separate workshops, and in one of them we saw there was a large number of small tubs. On one of them we saw a piece of cardboard lying, on which was written in capital letters, uranium 308.
It was the break they needed. The scientists at the laboratory outside Moscow got to work. Today there is a museum on the site, but in the early days the facility was covered only by a giant tent, and the working conditions were appalling. Despite the hardships, the scientists were eager to move ahead to the next stage and build their first experimental nuclear reactor. The reactor is still on view, 2 floors underground. Here, precious uranium was bombarded with neutrons and magically transformed into the more efficient plutonium the Soviets so badly needed. A former lab assistant remembers the mood the day the reactor was to go into commission.
I rode down to the storeroom and they dressed me up in smart clothes. I didn't have the slightest idea what it was all about. I arrived back and I'd come without a tie. Pavel Vasilievich shouted at the driver, "Where's his tie?" We managed to pick up a tie at a military base somewhere.
The reason for the tension was that Lavrenti Beria was coming to witness the big event. It was a crucial moment for the scientists. If the reactor didn't work, they knew they would probably lose their jobs, if not worse.
Beria arrived, and he was standing wearing his traditional 3-piece suit. He was a small, square-shouldered man, an impressive man, and Kurchatov introduced us. We began the demonstration. Our equipment lights came on. The needles on the gauges flickered. Sound signals came on. The guards got scared when the neutron counter started up. Ta-ta-ta-ta-ra.
The F-1 began to work at 1 minute after 6 in the evening. Less than 4 years were now left before a bomb must be ready for Stalin. Kurchatov was anxious that Beria understand how well his men had done, just to get this far.
Kurchatov says, "This is our chain reaction." He began showing Beria. And he says, "What are you showing me, Igor, my lad? You explode a bomb for me, and then I'll give you a kiss and a hug."
8 of Britain's newest transport planes, the big Handley-Page Hastings aircraft, have now joined in the RAF's Berlin airlift. Our pictures show them leaving Dischforth in Yorkshire on their flight to Germany.
In the summer of 1948, communism faced off against capitalism in a bitter clash over Berlin. An iron curtain descended across Europe, and the world came close to war.
Millions of people live or die depending on our adaptability.
Stalin was attempting to gain control of Berlin's Allied sectors by blockading the city. The British and Americans rushed in with their military planes and delivered enough food and coal to force Stalin to back down. It would be the last time the Soviets were caught without a nuclear bomb to back up their threats. Kurchatov's men had taken a giant step forward with the success of their first reactor. They were about to take another. A few hundred feet below the surface at Przybram in Czechoslovakia, fresh supplies of uranium captured from the Germans at the end of the war were being fed back to the Soviet Union. Exactly the opposite of what Manhattan Project boss General Groves was telling his own government.
The fact that Groves himself knew how difficult it was to get uranium out of low-grade ore, that led him to believe that it would take the Russians 20 years, because he thought they didn't have any good sources of uranium. In fact, they didn't really need good sources of uranium, although they had more sources than he thought they had. And at one point, he even told the Senate committee in 1946, Soviets have no uranium. Clearly not true. I mean, our own espionage with regard to what was going on in Russia was abysmal. I mean, terrible.
Two years had passed since Stalin's ultimatum. It was 1947, and the Soviets had both the raw material and the technology to manufacture plutonium for their bomb. What they needed now was a full-size nuclear reactor and the open space in which to build it. A young engineer named Vladimir Merkin was summoned to Kurchatov's office.
You're going to build a reactor in the Urals. Pack up your things. You're leaving tomorrow. When we arrived there, we saw that nothing's been built yet. There was nothing but a few barracks, ramshackled wooden buildings, mud and foundation stones lying all over the field. A table had been laid at the lakeside, and while we were there, some of the guys began to fish for tench. They were big tench, I remember that well. They set up several baking trays for fried potatoes, and we were hungry after all the traveling. We ate and drank with relish. I remember that to this day.
Merkin's job was to build a giant reactor that would make plutonium for the first red bomb. This is the complex he helped create. Today it is just a shell, and the reactor has been dismantled. But during its heyday, it produced enough plutonium to build hundreds of nuclear weapons.
People worked unstintingly, not counting the hours they put in the knowledge that completing the job quickly was vital for our country and our nation. It took us just 1 year and 8 months to build, from the very first day to the finish, when the reactor began working at its full design capacity. 1 year and 8 months.
700 miles away, behind the perimeter fence at Arzamas 16, Yuli Haraton now possessed the plutonium to complete his bomb. Inside the museum there, they still keep a replica of what he designed. Even to the lay eye, it is virtually identical to the model on show in the museum in New Mexico. Fat Man, the bomb America dropped on Nagasaki. Today, Haratan can finally speak openly about his early work.
Это бомба, точнее,
This bomb, or to be more accurate, the nuclear device inside this bomb, is basically a copy of the first nuclear device tested by the Americans in 1945.
американцами ядерного заряда.
In those days, it was an admission for which he would have been shot. By early summer of 1949, Kurchatov and Haratan were finally ready. Years of frantic work would now be put to the test. The bomb left Arzamas 16 on its 2,000-mile trip to a test site in desolate Kazakhstan. It was accompanied by soldiers, scientists, and the top men in the Politburo. Everyone's fate hung in the balance. Kazakhstan, August 29th, 1949, 6 a.m. Bomb codename First Lightning. Beria's last words to Kurchatov, just 10 minutes before the test. Nothing will come of it, Igor.
So Kurchatov leapt up and headed for the open door. At that point, the fireball was just forming and turning to a rising mushroom shape, illuminating the whole area with a brilliant light. And the cloud continued to rise. And at that point, Kurchatov, at full tilt, grabbed hold of Beria and hugged him. We did it. It worked. Now, Kurchatov wasn't a small man, and he crushed him so hard that Beria started screeching, "Let me go! Let me go, you throttling me!" But Kurchatov still wouldn't let him go. Beria kept shouting until the full mushroom cloud started to rise.
The news reached the West even before it was announced in the Soviet Union. The world was shocked at how quickly the Soviets had caught up. Stalin had his bomb, a year ahead of his own schedule. The landscape is still scarred by the moment when the arms race was joined. Two countries possessed the terrible power to destroy mankind. It was the beginning of the Cold War, a deadly competition that would grip the world for the next 40 years.